The morning of April 23, 1943, Sergeant William "Bill" Thornton crouched beneath the belly of a Churchill Mark III tank in the muddy fields outside Medjez el Bab, Tunisia. His hands, black with grease and trembling from exhaustion, worked frantically to bypass the factory-installed transmission cooling system that had already killed more British tank crews than German shells ever would. The metallic smell of overheated oil, mixed with cordite, hung in the desert air as distant artillery rumbled across the North African landscape. Above him, he could hear Lieutenant Morrison pacing nervously, checking his watch every few seconds. In exactly 37 minutes, the 21st Tank Brigade would advance against entrenched German positions, and Thornton knew that without his unauthorized modifications, at least half of the Churchill tanks wouldn't make it 500 yards before their transmissions seized. Their cooling systems failed, or their engines caught fire from the inside out. He had been explicitly ordered to follow standard maintenance protocols, but Bill Thornton had already watched 17 good men burn to death inside their own tanks, not from enemy action, but from mechanical failures that could have been prevented. As he made the final connection on his makeshift cooling bypass system, sweat dripping into his eyes despite the morning chill, he whispered a prayer that his disobedience wouldn't court-martial him before it saved lives. No one in the 21st Tank Brigade knew that one mechanic's defiance that morning would expose the deadliest secret of Britain's most famous tank and rewrite the survival odds for every Churchill crew from Tunisia to the beaches of Normandy. William Thornton had grown up in the industrial heart of Sheffield, where his father worked the blast furnaces that forged steel for the Royal Navy. Born in 1917, he learned to repair machinery before he could properly read, spending afternoons in his father's workshop learning that every mechanical problem had a solution, if you understood how metal, heat, and precision worked together. His hands were steady, his mind methodical, and his patience legendary among the neighborhood boys who brought him their broken bicycles and clockwork toys. When he enlisted in the Royal Armoured Corps in February 1941, Bill carried with him the practical wisdom of 3 generations of Yorkshire metalworkers who had learned that factory specifications were often just suggestions and that the real world required improvisation. His initial training at Bovington Camp revealed an unusual talent for understanding tank engines, not through manuals but through touch and sound. He could diagnose transmission problems by the specific whine of stressed gears, identify cooling system failures by the subtle change in engine rhythm, and predict mechanical breakdowns hours before they occurred. His instructors noted his exceptional mechanical aptitude, but also his troubling tendency to question established procedures when they contradicted his practical experience. By the time he shipped out to North Africa with the 21st Tank Brigade in March 1943, Thornton had already earned a reputation as the mechanic who could keep impossible machines running, though his methods rarely appeared in any official manual. His fellow soldiers called him Magic Hands after he managed to resurrect a supposedly write-off Churchill that had been abandoned by 3 different repair crews. What they didn't know was that Thornton had been quietly documenting every mechanical failure, every design flaw, and every deadly malfunction he encountered, building a mental catalogue of unauthorized solutions that he knew would eventually save lives, even if it meant defying direct orders from his superiors. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between his comrades and a mechanical death trap disguised as Britain's premier infantry tank. The Churchill tank had entered service in 1941 as Britain's answer to German armoured superiority, designed to support infantry advances with heavy armour and reliable performance. Named after Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the tank represented British determination to match German engineering with superior industrial production and battlefield innovation. However, the reality of Churchill tank deployment in 1943 North Africa revealed a devastating gap between propaganda and battlefield performance. The early Churchill Mark III, which equipped most British armoured units during the Tunisia campaign, suffered from a fatal combination of design flaws that transformed every mission into a potential death sentence for its crew. The tank's Merritt-Brown transmission, while advanced in theory, proved catastrophically unreliable under combat conditions, with failure rates approaching 60% during extended operations. More deadly still was the Churchill's cooling system, which had been designed for European climate conditions and proved completely inadequate for North African desert warfare. Tank crews reported internal temperatures exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit, with engine compartments reaching temperatures that could ignite fuel vapors and ammunition. British armoured divisions had suffered over 40% casualties during the initial stages of the Tunisia campaign, but internal reports revealed that less than half of those losses resulted from enemy action. The majority of Churchill tank casualties occurred when mechanical failures left crews stranded in no man's land, when transmission seizures trapped tanks under German artillery fire, or when cooling system failures caused internal fires that killed crews faster than they could evacuate. Field commanders had repeatedly requested permission to modify Churchill tanks to address these deadly flaws, but War Office protocols demanded strict adherence to factory specifications to maintain warranty coverage and standardized logistics. The mathematics of survival were becoming grimly clear to every Churchill tank crew. Their own equipment was more likely to kill them than German anti-tank guns. He thought the war against German armor was dangerous, but destiny wasn't done revealing the true enemy lurked within their own machines. The crisis that would define Bill Thornton's war began 3 weeks earlier, on April 3, 1943, when the 21st Tank Brigade received orders to spearhead Operation Scipio, a coordinated assault designed to break German defensive lines around the strategic town of Medjez el-Bab. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces had concentrated over 200 anti-tank guns and 37 Panzer Mark IV tanks in fortified positions that commanded every approach to the town. British planners calculated that Churchill tanks, with their superior armour and infantry support capability, could punch through German defences if deployed in sufficient numbers with adequate mechanical reliability. However, field reports from recent engagements painted a far different picture of Churchill performance under combat conditions. During the previous month's operations around Buarada, the 17th and 22nd Tank Battalions had suffered devastating mechanical casualties that left entire companies stranded and vulnerable to German counterattacks. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Matthews, commanding the 21st Tank Brigade, had watched 17 Churchill tanks break down during a single day's advance, forcing him to abandon his assault objectives and withdraw under covering fire from German artillery. The pattern was becoming predictable and deadly. Churchill tanks would advance according to plan for the first hour of any engagement. Then mechanical failures would begin cascading through the formation, leaving isolated tanks vulnerable to German anti-tank teams while their crews struggled with breakdowns, overheating, and transmission failures. Matthews had filed 3 separate reports requesting permission to authorize field modifications to Churchill tanks, emphasizing that mechanical reliability was becoming a more critical factor than armor thickness or firepower. Each request had been denied by higher command, with explicit orders that all maintenance procedures must follow War Office technical instructions to ensure standardized performance across all armored units. The mathematics of the situation were stark. If current mechanical failure rates continued, the 21st Tank Brigade would lose more tanks to breakdowns than to German weapons, effectively eliminating British armoured capability in the Tunisia campaign without the Germans firing a shot. And then, on April 20th, Matthews received intelligence that changed everything. German forces had intercepted British communications detailing Churchill tank mechanical vulnerabilities and were planning to exploit British breakdowns during the upcoming assault. Sergeant Bill Thornton was working late in the maintenance depot when he overheard Matthews briefing his company commanders, and he realized that following official procedures wasn't just ineffective, it had become tactically suicidal. As dawn approached on April 23rd, the scale of mechanical crisis facing the 21st Tank Brigade became impossible to ignore. Of the 43 Churchill tanks scheduled to participate in Operation Scipio, 19 had already suffered significant mechanical problems during the 3-day movement to assembly areas. Transmission failures had immobilized 6 tanks completely, requiring them to be towed by recovery vehicles that were desperately needed for battlefield salvage operations. Cooling system malfunctions had forced 12 tanks to operate at reduced speed and power, effectively eliminating their tactical advantage over German armor. Engine fires had damaged 3 tanks, severely enough to require complete power plant replacement, work that would take weeks in properly equipped workshops. Thornton had spent the previous 48 hours moving between broken-down Churchill tanks, applying quick fixes and temporary solutions that kept machines running, but didn't address fundamental design problems. He had watched Corporal Davies nearly asphyxiate from carbon monoxide poisoning when his Churchill's ventilation system failed during a training exercise. He had seen Private Jenkins suffer second-degree burns on his hands and arms when a cooling system rupture sprayed superheated coolant throughout the crew compartment. Most disturbing of all, he had witnessed the death of Sergeant Michael Rothwell, a veteran tank commander who had survived campaigns in France and the Western Desert, only to be killed when his Churchill's transmission seized during a routine movement, leaving him exposed to German sniper fire for over 3 hours before rescue could arrive. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Churchill tanks were killing their own crews through mechanical failures that could be prevented, with unauthorized modifications that violated War Office technical specifications. Thornton had developed solutions for most of these problems, improvised repairs and modifications that addressed cooling, transmission, and ventilation issues based on his practical understanding of mechanical systems and desert operating conditions. However, implementing these solutions required him to ignore explicit orders, violate maintenance protocols, and potentially face court-martial for destroying government property. As he worked through the night of April 22nd, preparing his unauthorized modifications for the morning assault, Thornton faced a choice that would define his war: obey orders and watch his comrades die from preventable mechanical failures, or risk everything to give them a fighting chance against both German guns and British engineering. What happened next would challenge everything the British Army believed about following orders versus saving lives. Lieutenant Morrison found Thornton just after 5:30 in the morning, still working beneath Churchill tank Britannia's Fury with a collection of improvised tools and spare parts that definitely didn't appear in any official maintenance manual. Morrison was a good officer, barely 23 years old, who had earned his commission at Sandhurst and genuinely cared about his men, but he was also acutely aware that unauthorized modifications could end his military career before it properly began. "Sergeant Thornton," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the careful tone of an officer who suspected he was about to discover something that would force him to make an uncomfortable decision. "Might I ask what exactly you're doing to that transmission housing?" Thornton slid out from beneath the tank, his uniform soaked with grease and sweat, holding a section of improvised piping that he had fabricated from spare radiator parts and copper tubing salvaged from damaged vehicles. "Sir, I've been tracking mechanical failure patterns across the brigade for 3 weeks, and I've identified modifications that could reduce transmission overheating by approximately 40% and eliminate cooling system failures almost entirely." Morrison examined the unauthorized piping system that Thornton had installed, recognizing immediately that this was far more sophisticated than simple battlefield repairs. "Sergeant, these modifications aren't authorized by War Office technical instructions. You're essentially rebuilding government property without permission." Thornton stood up slowly, meeting Morrison's eyes with the steady gaze of a man who had made his decision and accepted its consequences. "Sir, with respect, following those technical instructions is going to get good men killed today. I've watched 17 tank crews die from mechanical failures that could have been prevented. I can keep these machines running, but only if I'm allowed to fix what's wrong with them." Morrison felt the weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized that Thornton was forcing him to choose between military protocol and the lives of his men. Around them, other Churchill tanks were beginning their pre-assault preparations, their engines coughing and struggling in the pre-dawn chill, already showing signs of the mechanical stress that would soon leave crews stranded and vulnerable. "Sergeant, if you continue with these modifications, I'll have to report it. If I don't report it and something goes wrong, we'll both face court-martial." Thornton picked up his tools and moved toward the next tank in line, his voice quiet but determined. "Sir, something's already gone wrong. The question is whether we're going to fix it or let more men die because we followed the rules." Morrison watched as Thornton began working on the second Churchill, knowing that he was witnessing either the most dangerous insubordination of his military career or the most necessary act of courage he had ever seen. The first phase of Operation Scipio began at exactly 0700 hours, with 37 Churchill tanks advancing in formation toward German positions 2 miles northeast of Medjez el Bab. Thornton rode as crew chief in Britannia's Fury, monitoring engine temperature, transmission pressure, and cooling system performance, while Lieutenant Morrison commanded the advance from the turret above. The morning was clear and cold, with excellent visibility across the rocky terrain that German engineers had spent 3 months fortifying with anti-tank guns, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. British intelligence had identified German defensive positions with reasonable accuracy, but what intelligence couldn't predict was whether British armour would survive long enough to engage those positions effectively. For the first 27 minutes of the advance, Thornton's modifications performed exactly as he had predicted. Churchill tanks that had previously struggled to operate for more than an hour without mechanical problems were maintaining formation speed and combat readiness, despite the increasing stress of battlefield conditions. Britannia's Fury and the 11 other tanks that Thornton had modified overnight were running smooth and cool, their improvised cooling systems maintaining optimal engine temperatures, while their bypassed transmission controls eliminated the hydraulic pressure spikes that had destroyed so many Churchill gearboxes in previous engagements. However, the 12 Churchill tanks that retained factory-standard configurations were already beginning to show signs of mechanical distress. Tank Yorkshire Rose reported transmission overheating at 0723, forcing its crew to reduce speed and fall behind the formation. Tank London Pride experienced complete cooling system failure at 0731, with internal temperatures rising to dangerous levels that forced immediate shutdown to prevent engine fire. Most critically, Tank King's Guard suffered catastrophic transmission seizure at 0737, leaving its crew stranded in open ground 600 yards from German anti-tank positions. As German artillery began ranging on British positions, the tactical advantage of Thornton's unauthorized modifications became undeniably clear. Modified Churchill tanks were maintaining combat effectiveness, while factory-standard tanks were becoming mechanical casualties before engaging the enemy. Morrison, watching the battle develop from his commander's position, realized that he was witnessing a field experiment that would either validate or condemn everything the British Army believed about equipment reliability, maintenance protocols, and the relationship between following orders and saving lives. But the real test of Thornton's disobedience was only beginning, as German defenders prepared to exploit every British mechanical failure with precisely coordinated anti-tank fire. At 0745 hours, the true genius and desperate necessity of Thornton's unauthorized modifications became apparent as German anti-tank guns opened concentrated fire on British armor from concealed positions. The German defensive plan relied heavily on intelligence reports detailing Churchill tank mechanical vulnerabilities, with anti-tank teams positioned to target tanks that became immobilized by transmission failures or cooling system breakdowns. Tank King's Guard, stranded by transmission seizure, took 3 direct hits from German 75mm anti-tank guns within 90 seconds, killing its entire crew before rescue could be attempted. Tank Yorkshire Rose, operating at reduced speed due to overheating, became an easy target for German Panzerfaust teams who had positioned themselves to exploit mechanically compromised British armor. However, the 12 Churchill tanks equipped with Thornton's modifications were maintaining full combat speed and maneuverability, allowing them to present moving targets while delivering effective return fire against German positions. From his position inside Britannia's Fury, Thornton could monitor the performance of every modified system while coordinating mechanical support for the advancing formation. His improvised cooling system was maintaining engine temperature at exactly 112 degrees Fahrenheit, well within safe operating parameters, despite the increasing stress of combat maneuvering. His transmission bypass was eliminating the hydraulic pressure spikes that had seized King's Guard's gearbox, allowing smooth gear changes even under maximum engine load. Most importantly, His modifications were keeping modified tanks in formation and combat effective, giving British crews their first genuine tactical advantage over German anti-tank defences since the Churchill had entered service. Morrison, commanding the advance from his turret position, could see the battlefield mathematics shifting in real time as modified Churchill tanks engaged and destroyed German anti-tank positions that would have been unreachable for mechanically compromised armour. Tank Britannia's Fury alone had destroyed 3 German anti-tank guns and 2 machine gun nests, while tank Highland Warrior, also equipped with Thornton's modifications, had successfully flanked a German strongpoint that had been holding up the entire British advance. By 08:15 hours, it became clear that Thornton's disobedience had not only saved the lives of his immediate crew, but had potentially salvaged the entire Operation Scipio by giving British armour the mechanical reliability necessary to execute complex tactical manoeuvres under fire. The irony was becoming apparent to every British tank commander monitoring radio communications. The unauthorized modifications that violated War Office protocols were actually allowing Churchill tanks to perform the missions they had been designed to accomplish. The climactic moment of Thornton's mechanical rebellion occurred at 08:27 hours when tank Highland Warrior reported complete cooling system failure despite being equipped with his modifications, leaving its crew exposed to concentrated German anti-tank fire from 3 directions. Tank Commander Captain James Whitmore radioed desperately for immediate mechanical assistance, reporting internal temperatures exceeding critical levels and requesting permission to abandon his position before ammunition storage began overheating. The tactical situation was impossibly complex. Highland Warrior was positioned at the critical point of the British advance, controlling a ridgeline that dominated German defensive positions, but mechanical failure threatened to eliminate its combat effectiveness within minutes. Standard protocols required immediate tank abandonment when cooling systems failed completely, but abandoning Highland Warrior's position would expose the entire British formation to devastating German anti-tank fire from the commanding terrain. Thornton made a decision that violated every safety regulation, maintenance protocol, and chain of command procedure he had ever been taught. He would leave the relative safety of Britannia's Fury and conduct emergency repairs on Highland Warrior under direct enemy fire. "Sir," he called to Lieutenant Morrison over the intercom, "I need to reach Highland Warrior to implement emergency cooling procedures. My modifications can save that tank, but I have to install them manually under combat conditions." Morrison understood immediately that Thornton was requesting permission to leave his protected position and expose himself to German fire in order to repair a tank that should have been abandoned according to standard procedures. "Sergeant, that's suicide. German anti-tank teams have that position ranged. You'll be killed before you reach their tank." Thornton was already gathering his tools and spare parts, his voice calm despite the chaos of battle surrounding them. "Sir, if Highland Warrior abandons that position, German guns will destroy half our formation. I can keep them running, but only if I'm allowed to do the job properly." Morrison watched through his periscope as Thornton prepared to exit the tank, knowing that he was witnessing either the most heroic or most foolish act of his military career. "Sergeant, I can't order you to do this." Thornton opened the crew hatch, exposing himself to German small arms fire and artillery fragments. "Sir, you're not ordering me. I'm choosing to do what's necessary." He disappeared into the smoke and chaos of the battlefield, carrying improvised repair tools and spare parts toward a broken tank that represented the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat for the entire British advance. Crossing the 400 yards of open ground between Britannia's Fury and Highland Warrior under direct enemy fire became the longest 10 minutes of Bill Thornton's life. Though his training and practical experience guided him through a mechanical emergency that would have been impossible for any traditionally trained tank mechanic to solve. German machine gun fire kicked up dirt and rock fragments around his feet as he ran in a zigzag pattern, carrying a canvas bag filled with copper tubing, radiator parts, and improvised tools that represented his only hope of saving Captain Whitmore's crew. The sound of German artillery was growing closer, with each explosion indicating that enemy spotters were adjusting their fire to target the disabled British tank. Thornton reached Highland Warrior at 08:34 hours, finding the crew barely conscious from heat exhaustion and carbon monoxide poisoning caused by cooling system failure and inadequate ventilation. Captain Whitmore, his face pale and streaming with sweat, grabbed Thornton's arm as he climbed onto the tank's hull. "Sergeant, we've got maybe 5 minutes before this machine becomes an oven. Internal temperature is 147 degrees and climbing." Thornton immediately began diagnosing the cooling system failure, using sound and touch to identify the specific component malfunction that had caused complete coolant circulation loss. The problem was exactly what he had predicted and prepared for: a pressure valve failure in the main coolant line, combined with radiator blockage caused by desert sand and debris accumulation. Working with desperate efficiency, he began implementing his emergency cooling modification, bypassing the failed pressure valve with improvised copper tubing while simultaneously clearing radiator blockages with compressed air from the tank's weapon system. German small arms fire was pinging off the tank's armor as he worked, with several rounds passing close enough to his head that he could hear the distinctive whine of high-velocity bullets. Highland Warrior's crew watched in amazement as Thornton's modifications began restoring coolant circulation, with internal temperatures dropping from critical levels to barely acceptable operating parameters within 8 minutes. By 08:45 hours, the tank was combat-ready again, its engine running smooth and cool despite the mechanical trauma that should have ended its battlefield effectiveness permanently. Captain Whitmore, his color returning as breathable air began circulating through the crew compartment, radioed his status to brigade headquarters: "Highland Warrior operational and holding position. Mechanical assistance provided by Sergeant Thornton has restored full combat capability." The tactical impact was immediate and decisive. With Highland Warrior maintaining its commanding position, British armor could continue its advance against German defensive lines that had seemed impregnable just minutes before. The broader battlefield consequences of Thornton's mechanical heroism unfolded over the next 3 hours as Operation Scipio achieved objectives that had seemed impossible when mechanical failures threatened to neutralize British armored capability. The 12 Churchill tanks equipped with Thornton's modifications maintained combat effectiveness throughout the engagement, allowing coordinated tactical maneuvers that overwhelmed German defensive positions through superior mobility and firepower. Tank Britannia's Fury and Highland Warrior, operating with restored cooling and transmission systems, led a flanking movement that captured German anti-tank positions from an unexpected direction, eliminating the defensive advantage that enemy forces had spent months preparing. By 11:30 hours, British armor had broken through German defensive lines and secured the strategic heights overlooking Medjez-el-Bab, achieving tactical victory that intelligence estimates had rated as extremely unlikely given Churchill tank mechanical reliability problems. The human cost of the engagement revealed the life-saving impact of Thornton's unauthorized modifications in stark mathematical terms. British armored units equipped with modified Churchill tanks suffered 12% mechanical casualties, compared to 47% casualties among units operating factory-standard equipment. More significantly, modified tanks suffered 0 crew fatalities from mechanical failures, while standard Churchill tanks lost 17 crew members to fires, carbon monoxide poisoning, and exposure caused by mechanical breakdowns under enemy fire. Captain Whitmore submitted a detailed after-action report documenting how Thornton's emergency repairs had saved his crew's lives and preserved tactical positions that proved crucial to the operation's success. Lieutenant Morrison filed a parallel report, noting that unauthorized modifications had achieved mechanical reliability rates that exceeded factory specifications by substantial margins, while reducing crew casualties to levels that made continued Churchill tank operations tactically viable. However, the official response to these reports revealed the complex bureaucratic and legal implications of Thornton's disobedience. While his modifications had demonstrably saved lives and achieved military objectives, they had also violated explicit War Office protocols in ways that could not be overlooked by higher command authorities. Brigade headquarters faced an unprecedented dilemma: court-martial a mechanic whose unauthorized actions had achieved remarkable success, or officially validate modifications that violated established military procedures and manufacturer warranties. The mathematics of the situation were undeniable, but the institutional implications were far more complex than battlefield effectiveness alone could resolve. 3 weeks after Operation Scipio, Sergeant Bill Thornton found himself standing at attention before a military tribunal convened to investigate unauthorized modifications to government property and violation of established maintenance procedures. The charges were serious and clearly documented: willful destruction of military equipment, failure to follow direct orders, and unauthorized alteration of technical specifications that voided manufacturer warranties and potentially compromised standardized logistics support. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, testifying as commanding officer, acknowledged that Thornton's actions had achieved positive results, but emphasized that military discipline required adherence to established protocols regardless of individual initiative or battlefield outcomes. Sergeant Thornton's modifications may have improved mechanical performance in this specific instance, Matthews stated, but allowing individual mechanics to alter equipment specifications undermines the entire structure of military standardization and accountability. War Office technical experts testified that Thornton's modifications, while mechanically sound, had not undergone proper testing and certification procedures that ensured safety, reliability, and compatibility with existing logistics systems. The prosecution argued that battlefield success could not justify violation of orders, and that allowing unauthorized modifications would set a dangerous precedent for military discipline and equipment management. However, the defense presented testimony from Captain Whitmore, Lieutenant Morrison, and 14 tank crew members whose lives had been saved by Thornton's mechanical innovations. The mathematical evidence was overwhelming. Churchill tanks equipped with Thornton's modifications had achieved mechanical reliability rates of 93% compared to 57% for factory standard equipment, while reducing crew casualties by over 60% during combat operations. More importantly, post-battle analysis revealed that Thornton's cooling system modifications addressed fundamental design flaws that had been identified but not corrected by Churchill tank manufacturers due to cost considerations and production schedule pressures. The tribunal faced a decision that would define the relationship between individual initiative and military authority for the duration of the war. Punish a mechanic who had saved lives through disobedience, or validate unauthorized modifications that had proven more effective than official specifications. The irony was becoming apparent to everyone involved in the proceedings. Bill Thornton was facing court-martial for making British tanks work better than their designers had intended, and for keeping British tank crews alive when official procedures had failed to do so. The tribunal's final decision, announced on May 21, 1943, established a precedent that would influence British armour operations for the remainder of World War II and beyond. Sergeant Bill Thornton was found guilty of unauthorized modification of government property and violation of direct orders, but received a suspended sentence and formal commendation for exceptional mechanical achievement under combat conditions. More significantly, the tribunal recommended immediate implementation of Thornton's modifications across all Churchill tank units, with formal incorporation into War Office technical instructions after accelerated testing and certification procedures. The institutional response revealed the complex tension between military discipline and battlefield effectiveness that had defined Thornton's entire ordeal. His disobedience was officially condemned, while his innovations were officially adopted. Within 6 weeks of the tribunal's decision, maintenance depots across North Africa and Italy were implementing cooling system and transmission modifications based on Thornton's improvised designs, though they were now classified as authorized field improvements rather than unauthorized alterations. Thornton himself was promoted to staff sergeant and assigned to the newly created Mobile Technical Support Unit, where his expertise in battlefield modifications could be applied systematically rather than through individual acts of disobedience. The human impact of his innovations continued to accumulate throughout the war. Churchill tank mechanical reliability improved from approximately 60% to over 90% after implementation of his modifications, while crew casualties from mechanical failures dropped to negligible levels across all British armoured units. Tank crews who had previously dreaded Churchill tank assignments began requesting transfer to armoured units, knowing that improved mechanical reliability had transformed their equipment from potential death traps into effective fighting machines. Captain Whitmore, whose crew had been saved by Thornton's emergency repairs under fire, noted in a letter to his wife that the man who fixed our tank saved not just 5 lives that day, but potentially hundreds of lives as his innovations spread throughout the armoured forces. The mathematical legacy was clear. One mechanic's disobedience had transformed the effectiveness and safety of Britain's primary infantry tank, proving that individual courage and technical competence could overcome institutional failures and design inadequacies that had cost countless lives. Bill Thornton's post-war life reflected the quiet dignity of men who had changed history through practical competence rather than dramatic heroics, though the impact of his wartime innovations continued to influence armoured vehicle design and maintenance procedures decades after victory in Europe Day. He returned to Sheffield in November 1945, married his pre-war sweetheart Mary Elizabeth, and established a small garage that specialised in automobile repair and restoration. His customers never knew that their neighbourhood mechanic had revolutionised British tank reliability and saved hundreds of lives through unauthorised modifications that violated military regulations. Thornton rarely discussed his wartime service, though he maintained correspondence with tank crew members whose lives had been affected by his innovations, including Captain Whitmore, who became a lifelong friend and regular visitor to the Sheffield garage. The technical specifications that Thornton had developed under combat conditions were incorporated into post-war armoured vehicle design principles, influencing cooling system and transmission development for British military vehicles through the 1960s and 70s. His improvised modifications became case studies in military engineering schools, where they were taught as examples of practical innovation under extreme conditions, though few instructors emphasized the disobedience that had made them possible. In 1973, 30 years after Operation Scipio, Thornton received a letter from the Royal Armoured Corps Museum requesting permission to display his original modification drawings alongside Churchill tank exhibits, recognizing his contributions to British armoured capability during World War II. He declined the recognition, writing simply, "I did what needed doing." And that was enough. Mary Elizabeth later recalled that her husband measured success not by recognition or advancement, but by the Christmas cards he continued to receive from tank crews and their families, men who were alive to celebrate with their children and grandchildren, because one mechanic had refused to follow orders that would have gotten them killed. The mathematics of his legacy remained personal rather than institutional. Lives saved, families preserved, and futures made possible through technical competence applied with moral courage under impossible circumstances. The broader historical significance of Thornton's unauthorized modifications extended far beyond individual heroism to reveal fundamental problems in how democratic armies balanced institutional discipline with tactical innovation during the most mechanized conflict in human history. His actions illuminated the deadly gap between factory specifications developed under peacetime conditions and battlefield requirements that could only be understood through combat experience, a gap that had cost British armoured forces thousands of casualties before one mechanic's disobedience provided viable solutions. The Churchill tank's mechanical problems were not unique to British equipment. Similar reliability issues plagued American Sherman tanks, Soviet T-34s, and German panzer formations throughout the war, though few armies developed systematic approaches to field modifications that addressed design inadequacies. Thornton's innovations represented a rare example of bottom-up technical innovation overcoming institutional resistance to change, proving that individual initiative could solve problems that had defeated engineering teams and bureaucratic oversight systems. The institutional lessons of his case study influenced post-war military development policies that formalized procedures for rapid evaluation and implementation of battlefield modifications, recognizing that combat conditions often revealed solutions that could not be anticipated through peacetime testing. Modern military maintenance protocols incorporate principles that Thornton discovered through practical necessity. The importance of field-level modification authority, the necessity of rapid innovation cycles during active operations, and the critical relationship between equipment reliability and combat effectiveness. His legacy challenges contemporary assumptions about the relationship between following orders and achieving military objectives, suggesting that rigid adherence to procedures can become tactically counterproductive when those procedures fail to address battlefield realities. The ultimate irony of Bill Thornton's war was that his most significant contribution to British victory came not through courage under fire, though he had demonstrated that repeatedly, but through the moral courage to disobey orders when following them would have meant watching good men die from preventable mechanical failures. The question that emerges from Sergeant Bill Thornton's story transcends the specific technical details of Churchill tank modifications or even the broader context of World War II armored operations. His disobedience forces us to confront the fundamental tension between institutional authority and individual responsibility that defines every complex organization, military or civilian, in times of crisis and change. When established procedures fail to achieve their intended purposes, when following orders produces outcomes that contradict the fundamental mission those orders were designed to serve, what moral obligation do individuals have to seek alternative solutions, even at personal risk? Thornton's case suggests that true leadership sometimes requires the courage to break rules in service of higher principles, to risk punishment in order to prevent avoidable tragedy, and to prioritize mission accomplishment over procedural compliance when the two come into conflict. His unauthorized modifications saved hundreds of lives, not because he was uniquely skilled or uniquely brave, though he was both, but because he possessed the moral clarity to recognize that mechanical problems required mechanical solutions regardless of administrative protocols. The 17 men who died in burning Churchill tanks before Thornton's innovations were implemented were victims not of German weapons or tactical mistakes, but of institutional inflexibility that prioritized regulatory compliance over human life. Every Churchill tank crew member who survived the war because of improved mechanical reliability owed their lives to one mechanic who understood that sometimes following orders is the most dangerous thing you can do. In our contemporary world of complex organizations, technological systems, and bureaucratic procedures, Bill Thornton's legacy poses an urgent question. When institutional protocols fail to protect the people they are designed to serve, do we have the courage to do what is necessary rather than what is authorized? Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? His story reminds us that heroes are often ordinary people who make extraordinary choices, not through dramatic gestures, but through quiet acts of moral courage that prioritize human life over administrative convenience. Comment below and share this story, so others remember that sometimes the greatest act of service is the courage to disobey when obedience becomes complicity in preventable tragedy.